At my grandson's baby shower, my daughter-in-law held up the blanket I'd spent 4 months knitting, wrinkled her nose, and dropped it in a trash can. "We only use designer things here," she said, smiling for her friend's camera. The room gave that awful, nervous half-laugh. I didn't argue. I walked over, lifted the blanket back out of the bin, folded it into my bag, and left without a word. That night my son called, his voice breaking. "Mom," he said, "what was folded inside that blanket?" "My name is Darlene Mercer. I'm 68. For 40 years I ran a tailoring shop, and I know exactly what a garment is worth by something that has nothing to do with its price tag. My hands aren't what they used to be. Arthritis took care of that, which is exactly why 4 months of knitting cost me so much, and why I did it anyway. My husband Frank died 10 months before that shower, after 43 years of marriage. He wasn't flashy, he drove the same truck for 19 years. But he was a planter, not a spender. A week before he died, he asked me to bring him an old cigar box from his closet. Inside were 30 years of savings bonds, a little at a time, every birthday and bonus. All bought for a grandchild who didn't exist yet. For our first grandbaby. The envelope read, dated the year our son Kyle turned 10. They'd come due, just under $50,000. Frank gave me one instruction that mattered more than the money itself. "Don't just hand them an envelope," he said. "They'll spend it on a stroller and forget where it came from. Sew them into something. Make her open the blanket. Make them find it. Make it last." So I knitted a cream-colored blanket with tiny blue sailboats, Frank's initials hidden in one corner. It took 4 months and every ounce of strength my hands had left. On the underside, I sewed a hidden inner pocket and folded in all 30 years of bonds, along with a letter Frank had dictated to me from his hospital bed, addressed to a grandchild he'd never meet, sealed to be opened at 18. I stitched the pocket shut, wrapped the whole thing in plain paper, and drove to the shower talking to Frank the whole way. My daughter-in-law Madison had been raised by a mother, Gail, who measures everything by its label. The baby shower was a full production, a photographer friend named Brooke filming everything, a designer registry, a gift table where Madison held up each present, named the brand, and thanked the giver for the camera. My son Kyle stood against the wall the whole time, quiet, the way he's always been, gentle, conflict avoidant, the kind of man who chooses easier over everything else. Frank's sister Caroline sat with me and, not knowing any better, whispered that she knew what was hidden in the blanket. The famous blanket, she called it, thinking everyone already knew. I told her Frank's wish was for Madison to discover it herself. I never got the chance to warn her. When my plain cream box came up last on the gift table, Madison unwrapped it, held the blanket up by 2 corners like she was checking it for stains, and her face did something I recognized instantly. The tiny flicker of disgust that means someone's been taught homemade equals poor. "Oh," she said, "did you make this? That's so sweet. Very homemade." Gail added her signature, bless her heart, and I still thought the worst of it was over. Then Madison, playing entirely to Brooke's camera, walked to the trash can at the end of the table, held the blanket over it, said, "We only use designer things here," and dropped it in. The room laughed. My son opened his mouth and said nothing. I could have shouted. I could have told the whole room exactly what she'd just thrown away. But 3 things stopped me. The bonds were safe, sewn shut where she'd never find them. Brooke's camera had captured the cruelty itself, which meant the truth would keep without my help. And I understood, in that instant, that the real punishment wasn't a scene, it was the truth, delivered later, when she could no longer pretend not to know. So I stood, walked to the trash can, lifted the blanket out, brushed it off, folded it, and put it in my bag. "It's not really your kind of thing," I told Madison calmly. I'll keep it. I said my goodbyes and left with my back straight. I didn't cry until I reached the car, and even then, what broke me wasn't the trash can. It was that Frank's last gift now smelled faintly of garbage. By the time I stopped crying, something in me had gone very still and certain. I was not handing those bonds to a woman who threw legacies away for content. But the baby, innocent little Hudson, still deserved his grandfather's gift. Frank had saved it for the child, not the child's mother. Caroline called first, mortified, admitting she'd let it slip to Kyle in the parking lot that the blanket held $50,000 in bonds and Frank's last letter, not realizing Kyle hadn't known any of it when he watched his wife toss it in the trash and laughed along nervously to avoid a scene. 3 minutes later, Kyle called me, his voice already breaking. When I confirmed I had the blanket safe, he exhaled like a man surfacing from underwater. Then he asked the question that had been building all day. What was inside it? I told him gently and completely, the 30 years of bonds, the letter meant for Hudson at 18. Everything Frank had sewn into that blanket with his whole heart. The line went silent, and then my gentle, peacekeeping son made a sound I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy. I didn't stop her, Mom, he said. I was right there, and I didn't stop her. I let him cry. Then he asked what I wanted to do, and for the first time in years, I heard something like a spine in his voice. When Kyle told Madison the truth that night, her first words weren't horror or remorse. They were, how was I supposed to know? Who sews money into a blanket? This is kind of her fault, honestly. Not once did she say she was sorry and mean it. That told me everything I needed to know about handing her an inheritance. I took the bonds to the bank and confirmed the total, $47,000. Then I met with an estate professional and set up a locked education trust in Hudson's name alone. Money for his schooling and his future, untouchable by Madison, by Kyle, by me. Frank's wish was for the baby, and the cleanest way to honor it was to make it impossible to bend. Hudson arrived a few weeks later, furious and frowning exactly like his grandfather. Holding him, I saw Frank so clearly I had to sit down. But watching Madison's first staged, filtered photo of the baby, captioned with brand names, I knew the softness of new motherhood was a phase, not a change in values. Frank's letter and his lesson mattered more than ever. I invited the whole family to Sunday dinner at my house: Kyle, Madison, Gail, Caroline. I set the blanket, washed clean, at the center of the table. After dinner, I picked up my seam ripper, opened the pocket in front of everyone, and laid out the bonds and the sealed letter like a banker counting a fortune. This is what you held in your hands at the shower, I told Madison, my voice steady and gentle, which somehow made it worse for her. $47,000 and the last words of a dying man. This is what you called homemade. This is what you dropped in a trash can on camera. Madison reached immediately for the victim's role. How was I supposed to know? You set me up, I told her plainly. Frank asked that the gift be hidden so it would be treasured, not spent. My only mistake was assuming no one would throw a handmade blanket away. The throwing was entirely hers. Then I laid out the terms. Hudson would get every cent, but not as an open gift. It would sit in a locked trust, untouchable by anyone, including Kyle. The blanket would come home with me until I trusted it would be honored. When Madison tried to argue, Kyle finally spoke. One word: don't. In a voice I'd never heard him use with her. She closed her mouth and kept it closed. I read the family the short note Frank had written for the day they learned the truth. That he'd been saving since Kyle was 10 because the best gift his own grandfather ever gave him was proof someone had thought of him before he existed. That he hoped Hudson's family would learn the difference between what something costs and what it's worth. Learn it from your grandmother. The room went silent. Caroline wept. Kyle pressed his face to his sleeping son's head, shoulders shaking. Madison looked at the blanket like she was finally, actually seeing it. I told them I hadn't done this to humiliate anyone, only so that Hudson would grow up knowing there was another way to measure things besides a label. And I told Kyle directly, the real inheritance wasn't the bonds. It was learning not to stay quiet when quiet is easier. The trust sits locked and growing, exactly as Frank intended. Brooke's video of the trash can moment had already circulated before anyone knew what it held. Madison took it down once the truth came out, but enough people had seen it that she spent a long season being known, in her own circle, as the woman who threw away her son's inheritance for a laugh. She never fully apologized. She isn't built for it, but she did ask me, a few weeks later, to teach her to knit. We made Hudson a lopsided first hat together. She kept it. Kyle changed the most. He told me later that the blanket wasn't the first time he'd failed his father by staying quiet, just the one he couldn't unsee. He and Madison are in counseling now. He's promised to teach Hudson to fish himself, the way Frank always meant to. The blanket lives on Hudson's crib now, in a house that finally learned to look twice before it decides what something's worth. My hands are worse this winter, but on the good days I'm knitting Hudson a sweater, with his grandfather's initials hidden in the cuff, for him to find, someday, if he knows to look. The world will keep telling you worth is something printed on a label. Don't believe it. The most valuable things in any room are almost always the quiet ones, made by hand, given without a logo, and easy to throw away if no one ever taught you how to look.